Hi, everyone. I'm the Training Resource Coordinator, Hanovi Schoonover, and I'd like to welcome you to the webinar. Before we begin, for those who may not know, Redwind is a nonprofit organization that provides tribal technical assistance on a variety of programs, including, but not limited to, housing and homeless services, children and youth, and elder abuse. This ranges from policy review by email to site visits. If you are interested, you can contact me at hanovi@red-wind.net. That's HONOVI at red-wind.net. And our presenter's information will be later on. As this states, this project is supported by grant number 2017 TAAX K023, awarded by the Office of Violence Against Women, United States Department of Justice. The opinions, findings, conclusions, and recommendations expressed in this publication, program/exhibition are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the U.S. Department of Justice. This webinar is part of our Children and Youth Project. Presenting with us today are Amber Warman and Victoria Ybanez. Amber is the Children and Youth Project Coordinator for Redwins Consulting. She is an enrolled member of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe in South Dakota, but she grew up in both the cities of Ohio and on the reservations of North Dakota. She graduated from the United Tribal Technical College with a Bachelor's of Science in Criminal Justice, and she previously worked as a CNA providing care for adults and children with disabilities, giving direct care and mentorship to youth in corrections and shelter. Victoria developed and is the executive director of Redwins Consulting from 2005 to present, and has been working to end violence against American Indian and Alaskan Native women for 35 years. She has a depth of experience working closely with tribes in developing and implementing a range of responses to violence against Indigenous women, and has conducted numerous on-site visits, as well as facilitated sessions and trainings for tribes over the past 20 years. She's experienced working intertribally as well as within a tribe's local culture, coordinating and providing tribal technical assistance for recipients of the Tribal Governments Program for the U.S. Department of Justice Office on Violence Against Women. If you have any questions or comments, you can put them into the chat box, the Q&A, or click the little hand icon, and we will be able to see that. And I'll now turn it over to our presenters.
Next slide. Hi, I'm Victoria Ybanez, and I'm really glad to be here. And when we think about children and youth, I'm glad that you all are joining as well, because it's such an important topic in the work that we do. Amber?
Hi, everyone. I'm Amber Warman. I'm the Children and Youth Training and Technical Assistance Coordinator for Redwind. I just want to welcome you all here and thank you for joining us, like Vicki said, on this important topic of helping create a brighter future for our Indigenous youth and children in our Indigenous communities all over the United States, on and off the reservation. And if you guys have any questions or need any assistance throughout this, please feel free to message myself or Vicki or Hanovi on the call. And we also have our website listed at the end of this. So if you guys need more assistance at the end, if you're looking for more information, please feel free to reach out to us at any time. With that, we'll get started. Next slide. We also just want to acknowledge that some of the topics we may discuss may be difficult. Talking about sexual assault, domestic violence is never easy. So if anything brings back any bad memories for anyone, or you feel you need to talk, remember that Vicki and I are both trained advocates, and we are here for you. And not just us, but our staff is also well trained. And if you feel that you need someone to talk to, or if anything comes up today, please feel free to reach out to us. Next slide.
And just briefly about Redwins Vision, we were created to engage in work that strengthens the responses that tribal programs and Native organizations are developing. And through our Children and Youth Training and Technical Assistance Project, we're really focused on helping our tribal programs and Native programs to develop their response to children and youth and really think in thoughtful ways about how they can be responding to children and youth. Often we hear that, we don't serve children and youth, and that might be true in terms of your grants, but many of your programs actually have children and youth coming through your programs. So it's critical for you to be thinking about the way that you're working so that you can have positive impacts with the contact that you have. Next slide.
So we just wanted to give you an opportunity to think about what your vision is and for your organization, how you're keeping youth, children and victims in mind during your planning and policy meetings, what's going on in your organization, how can you make policy changes? And that's kind of some things we'll talk about here today, but just kind of want to take notes or think about how you're helping children and youth in your community. We'll kind of come back to that later and maybe you can share with us. Vicki, did you have anything else here?
No, I'm good.
Next slide. At Redwin, we wanted to acknowledge the 574 federally recognized tribes and the 201 displaced tribes across the United States, affecting tens of thousands of tribal members across the USA. We see you and we are all related. We recognize all tribal members are unique individuals based on their own life experience, tribal customs, tribal lands, spirituality, and upbringing. There is no one size fits all training that's going to cover Indian country. As we focus on children and youth in Indian country, we acknowledge the thousands of young Indigenous children ages 0 to 21 being returned to their tribes and families from who were removed and placed into children assimilation camps across Canada and the USA. We pray for our people and we will continue to do creator-driven work to heal our people. We know that trauma is deeply rooted in our culture as Native people, as we see here in this acknowledgement of our tribes. And as we continue to heal daily, we just want to recognize each and every one of you as individual members and recognize that you are unique. And we are grateful for you to be here with us today and for the opportunity to meet with you and your tribes and come together to find solutions to Indigenous problems and also to feed off of Indigenous strength, and that we all have that within us. We are the resiliency of our grandmothers and grandfathers. Because of them, we are here today, and we will find solutions to help our people through their knowledge. Thank you. Next slide, please. Understanding the context of Indigenous children, youth victims, and survivors. Tribal communities are at a high risk for child maltreatment because of mistreatment of our Indigenous families and communities. Recognize the lingering effects of historical policies and practices, including the removal of tribes to reservations and relocation of Indigenous people to major cities and specific attempts to assimilate our children, youth, and families. On a personal note, part of the reason why my introduction talks about being raised not only on the reservation, but in the cities of Ohio, is that my grandmother herself was a part of that relocation program. Her tribe, Cheyenne River, gave her $25,000 to relocate to the cities. And there are many tribal members in large cities that are not recognized and don't enroll their children and don't find their way back home like my grandmother did. She eventually relocated back to South Dakota to be close to her mother and family, which is why I was able then to grow up on the reservation and have that connection. But I feel like sometimes that's lost in who we are. We just think, oh, well, I'm a city native. Like we're all connected and we all have roots. And so finding out where those roots are from and how we're connected and how this happened to us is important. Next slide. We all have ancestors. Everybody has a past. I don't feel, and I don't think that our organization feels like any non-tribal member doesn't have a past, and it doesn't necessarily mean that your relatives were colonizers. And even if they were colonizers, that's okay. We all have a purpose, we all have an ancestry, and it's about healing, and it's about the journey. We're here now in the present moment. How do we help our children heal for the future? Looking forward to those next 7 generations without forgetting about those 7 generations behind us. Merging them together right now and right here is what we're about. And so that's the solutions we're looking for as we continue. Next slide. A Lakota teaching. In Lakota society, it was the duty of every parent to give the knowledge they possessed to their children. Each parent was a teacher, and as a matter of fact, all elders were instructors of those younger than themselves. And the instruction they gave was mostly through their actions. That is, they interpreted to us through their actions what we should try to do. We learned by watching and imitating examples placed before us. Slowly and naturally, the faculties of observation and memory became highly trained. The Lakota child became educated in manners and the customs of his people without a stain and conscious effort. Luther Standing Bear Oglala Lakota. The reason that I thought it was really important to put this teaching in here, not only is it beautiful, but it resonated with something that my grandmother told me a long time ago, which is that part of our society is being lost because as parents, we constantly have to discipline our children because we don't have that tribal community as much anymore. We don't have our aunties and uncles right there raising our children with us in the day-to-day. And it's important that our aunties and uncles sometimes would step in and give the parents the opportunity to be those sole person that loved and doted on their child. In today's society, the parent not only has to be the person that's showing the child love, but also has to be the disciplinarian. And sometimes that creates, because our words are supposed to be used for good, sometimes our words then have to be used for discipline. And that, if not done in the right way, can cause conflict. And so how do we get back to this tradition of making sure that we're leading with a good example, that we're using good words when we discipline our kids, and that we're using good examples with our hands, with our self-care, and leading by a good example when we're not only being parents, but educators and teachers and advocates. So just wanted to share that that history is there and available to us. And sometimes it's about digging it out and remembering that that holistic care and wraparound services that we talk about in today's society comes from somewhere. A lot of our teachings that we're trying to utilize today come from a very traditional thinking of circular and of coming full circle. So teaching our youth in a way that someday they're going to take care of us. And so this child that is now just a tiny baby will someday be the person that takes care of me when I'm an elder. And so I'm going to show them in a good way so that they learn in a good way. And that's what it's all about, is just slow movement in good ways. Next slide.
Yeah, and I just want to follow up just a little bit from what Amber was saying, is that as a part of the work that we do, we have this window of opportunity to make a difference in children's lives. And oftentimes we don't think children are watching us or that they noticed, but they're listening and they're seeing and they're watching and learning from all of what we do, even if we're not a parent, even if we're not involved day to day in a child's life. And I've heard from advocates over the years talk about, well, geez, that's not my job. I'm not good with children. And the reality is that because children are around, we need to figure out how to be able to interact, and at the very least to see them. And when I say to see them, that really means a lot, that we recognize them in our space, and we treat them as children, as who they are. As Amber was talking about this just a few minutes ago, it made me think about, I was working with the Zuni tribe on a project, And in the process of things, we were talking about their creation stories and about children. And they basically said that the word for children translates into little Zuni. And that the way they talked about it is that by not having an entirely different word to name children, by recognizing them as Zuni people, and just that they were little Zuni, really put it in context about their responsibility for care and seeing them as parts of the community. So I just wanted to share that. So we're going to cover some statistics that goes through and helps us to understand the prevalence around the impacts of violence on our Indigenous children. And in some instances, we don't have specific data related to Native children, and we can make some assumptions. And then the other piece in there is that we also must recognize that because of the rates of violence that we have experienced and the historical and multi-generational trauma mixed with the current trauma, that the impacts may even be way more significant. So we're going to go through that over the next few slides. Next.
According to the United States Department of Justice, violent crime rates in Indian country are more than 2.5 times the national rate, and some reservations see more than 20 times the national rate. An average of 4.1 lifetime traumas have been reported, with the threat of injury and witnessing injury being the most common form of trauma exposure. With these alarming rates, it's important to understand that it is likely that children exposed to violence at home are experiencing trauma and may suffer from long and short-term effects of trauma. Next slide. What I do want to say here, though, about exposure to violence is that even though we can talk about it and in the form that we're talking about it, reading off statistics isn't really my thing, because when we really think about trauma in schools, we're talking about two parents fighting all night. We're talking about a child being up way past bedtime. We're putting our kids to bed, 8, 9, 10 o'clock, somewhere in between there. We're talking about a kid that's been up since all night till 2 o'clock in the morning, because that's when their parents are getting home from the bar and they're drinking and fighting. And then from there, that's escalating to them getting up late for school, coming in late for school. When you're walking in that door late for school, now you've got principals and teachers looking at you and other students, geez, you're late again, and putting all that pressure on the student. And so taking it out of not just the statistics of what it is, but taking it as a human being, as a child that's going to school, that's hurt, that can't explain what's going on at home, because to them, that's just normal. That is normal. And it's not just normal at home for them, it's normal for them and all their friends. It's a regular occurrence that our parents are out and that they're coming home late, that there is only one parent in the home, that there are no parents in the home. Drugs and alcohol are a big part of our reservations and communities, unfortunately. And so we need to have a response to these statistics in schools and what it really looks like for kids. Because it's one thing to talk about a child being exposed to violence and what it looks like to be bullied at school, what child abuse might look like, sexual assault in the community, dating violence. But what does it really look like when it's walking into your school, when it's walking into your advocacy center? It doesn't look the same. It looks like a quiet girl who's not talking very much, a student who's might be dressed just fine. Maybe they have money. It's not money. It's an attitude. It's maybe they're harassing other students because they see their mother getting harassed every day. That's normalcy to them. And so we got to think outside the box on how we're going to really change that for our kids and make school a safe place for them to come, and also make sure that there are safe resources for them in the school so that they know who they can contact if they're seeing abuse, or if they're seeing bullying, or what teen dating violence looks like before it's too late and we have teen pregnancy as the next issue. It's about somewhat of this conversation being prevention, even though it's not just about prevention, it's about creating a response and how we can really deal with it when it's reaching our schools and advocacy centers. Historical trauma and sexual violence associated with racism, prejudice, and discrimination also play a role in increasing children's risk for poor health and educational outcomes as a result of exposure to trauma. So again, we're thinking about our Native students being, a lot of times our schools are not predominantly Native American educators. They're outsiders coming in to support educational systems. So they're being discriminated. What looks like a kid that's having outbursts in class, you know, how do we recognize that that's not just an outburst, that it's trauma? So just kind of things to think about as we continue the conversation here. For some communities, such as American Indians, Alaskan Natives, and African American communities in the US, the legacy of historical trauma is a current and ongoing traumatic experience that compounds other traumatic events. So basically, it's not that we just woke up today in trauma, it's that trauma has been going on for lifetimes. It's tracing it back to our ancestors and the events that happened. Next slide. I think for myself, one of the ways that I trace it back, and I'm not going to go too far up subject, but for myself, it's being able to look back at my great grandmother and see where my grandmother was taken from her. I can only imagine as a mother what it would be like to have to experience my daughter at 3, 4, 5 years old being taken from my arms and sent to a boarding school, assimilation camp, whatever you want to recognize it as. It was inappropriate. In today's society, no one would be able to pull up at someone's house and take their children without a pretty big fight or argument. Kidnapping charges would be pressed. You can't do that kind of thing. But we're talking 2 generations, 3 generations ago, this happened. And I was lucky enough to meet my great grandmother. This isn't some far off figure I don't know. I knew this woman. I can only imagine what her pain would have been like to have lost her daughter at such a young age. And then I see it again in my grandmother and the abuse that she had to endure in that boarding school. And then later on in life, the marriage that she went through, that was also a domestic violence, abusive situation. And because that's what her normal was, growing up being abused by nuns and priests, it was a normalcy for her to grow up and then become in an abusive relationship. And then how that affected her children. For many years, part of my story and sharing was more so about the abuse that I went through. Now I can recognize the abuse that my mother and grandmother went through and put that story into place of it's not my fault and it isn't their fault. There was trauma going on in each one of those relationships that trickled down to make me who I am today. And so letting part of that go and being able to forgive myself so I can move forward. And that's part of what advocacy is for me. That's part of my why, is I want to help other people understand what trauma is so that they can help themselves individually. But we all have our own mission. We all have our own reason why we're in this work, and people that we love who experience domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, are missing and have been murdered, unfortunately. And unfortunately, I feel like I know someone and have people in every single one of those situations whom I love. And so how can I help support them? And so this is part of that work that we're doing and bringing these statistics to you. And we don't want to just read off these statistics like they're numbers and they don't mean anything, but they're more so for later when you have the opportunity. So you have these statistics, you can look at your work and say, okay, here's the numbers. And 40% of US teens ages 14 to 17 are exposed access to intimate partner violence in their lifetime. And what does that mean for me and my community? How can I use those numbers for funding? What does it mean to really service a teen that is in an intimate partner violence situation? How can I really help that teen? And is that where our resources need to go? Maybe when I'm looking at 14 to 17-year-olds, I'm realizing I do need to do some work in my community for that age group, because maybe we're already hitting the little kids. We need to get those teens involved in some prevention and some activities, some positive activities. Vicki, did you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, and I also think that when we think about these numbers, is these are quite large. When you think about violence, 40% of US teens, 14 to 17 have been exposed to at least one form. That's nearly 1 in 2 teenagers. 17.9%, that's 1 in 5, nearly 1 in 5 children. 60%, over 1 in 2 children have experienced at least direct or witnessed violent victimization in the past year, and then 14%. So 1 in 8 or 1 in 7, something like that. Those are huge numbers, which basically, when we think about who children are, they're our future. Our entire future, they're our future. And if we don't do something significant to intervene for the children to help strengthen their ability to recover from that, to walk forward from that, people talk a lot about resiliency. And for me, I think about resiliency as a part of it, but we really want them to heal from the trauma so that as they become adults, as they go into their futures, that they're not repeating the patterns of what they've seen around them. And we have a chance to change. And when we think about our little children and that they're experiencing this kind of stuff, how do we then protect them? How do we help them survive and thrive after this violence? Next slide. So again, similarly thinking about, siblings, assaults accounting for 29% of physical assaults experienced by children. And one of the things we have to remember is that children are not born as violent people. They are born in their purest form. And it's through the environment that they're around that they learn this behavior. And so the fact that there's that type of assaults happening between siblings is huge. So we're talking nearly 1 in 3 of 14 to 17-year-olds who are experiencing that, which again is quite significant. Also, 30% of children report moderate or frequent involvement in bullying in some capacity. And it really is this piece about children are learning this in the home or somewhere else or both. And as a part of that, they're translating it into developing ways that they're acting out those aggressions. And without proper tools, proper guidance, proper support, as well as healing and recovery, they're going to continue to perpetuate that and grow into adults that can continue that behavior. 9.5% of all children ages 0 to 17 and 11.4% of children reported some sexual victimization in their lifetimes. So again, we're talking 1 in 10. And when we, near 1 in 10 or over 1 in 10 children have experienced some form of sexual victimization, which is horrible to think about our small children experiencing that. And then how do we work with our children in a way that helps them recover? And how do we create the environment so that they can come to a place where they can develop trust, as well as the skills to recognize what's happening and ask for help when they need it. Next slide. So consequences for health, education, and community. So basically, if we aren't addressing this, the exposure to violence is going to have serious long-term consequences. And when we think about those long-term consequences, it plays out in every aspect of a person's life. So a child, the consequences from the impact of this violence is going to affect them at home and their behaviors at home. It's going to affect them in school as they interact as a student, as well as they interact in their social lives. And it's the other thing that we know is that long-term unaddressed trauma starts to imprint itself in our DNA. So it's going to have a longer effect. And basically our children, without the supports and the guidance and the opportunities for healing, and what will happen then is that it's going to carry into their futures, which is really scary when I think about that. Next slide. So here's an example of a consequence. So when we think about youth, ages 10 to 17 that have engaged in delinquent behavior in the past year, there are reported higher rates of exposure to violence than their peers who reported little or no delinquent behavior. So basically what that is telling me is that when children are experiencing violence, that their exposure, and when we talk about exposure, it means that they have witnessed it, they have experienced it, they have heard it, they have seen it through different aspects. And I know with victims that I have, adult victims that I've worked with over time, that they will say, oh, my children never saw. My children were asleep in bed. And the reality is that probably not. And that there's a high likelihood that even when you thought that they were not exposed to it, not able to see or to hear, that there's a high likelihood that they did. One adult child, a teenager, someone who was 19 years old that I worked with years ago, talked about the violence in their home, and would go to bed and know that things were happening in the household, that there was this teenager was, as a child, was able to feel that the energy was changing in the house and that there was a potential for violence coming based on what the adults were doing, and particularly what his father was doing. And that after he would go to bed and when he would start to hear sounds, he would get up onto the dresser that sat by the door. And in his room, he had 2 other siblings in there. And he would sit on the dresser with a bat and never used it, but he was sitting there in terror, thinking that after his father was done beating his mother, that he would come in and beat the kids. And this is what a child grew up with. And what it did was it laid a foundation for future behaviors. And that particular person at 19 years old had already been involved with the juvenile justice system, and it had a huge impact on them. Fortunately, that person was getting a lot of support when I was able to work with that person and engage with that person. And I would hope that the long-term outcome for that child, that young person, would have the opportunity to make a difference and continue the healing and recovery from that violence. And when we think about those formative years as children, as we talk about developmental stages, that lays the foundation for how we think about our lives, whether we trust, whether we imagine risky situations, whether we feel heightened sense of alertness and fearfulness. things like that, as well as playfulness and joy. So when that's absent in a child's life, it's going to have a lot lasting impact and really requires a lot of effort to address that. Amber, did you want to make comments?
I guess I just would like to say that as I worked in youth corrections for about 5 years of my life, I found that I wish I had kept statistics, but most of the kids coming in there didn't have a good home life. A lot of them are going back to drugs and alcohol at home, which is why they were in the correctional center in the first place. And we've got kids in there selling for their parents. And at the end of the day, kids just want to make their parents proud and happy. And I'm not saying that every parent is responsible for the behavior of their kids, because there are other things sometimes that play, mental health issues, or sometimes there can be sexual assault from an outside family member or friend or neighbor. So there are other places that trauma can happen. It's not always on the parent, but it is on us as parents and as guardians and advocates and friends of children to make sure that we're recognizing the symptoms and not just the behavior, but what's really going on with this kid. If this is an abnormal behavior, if this is the way the kid has always been, how am I helping guide them to the right resources as an advocate? How can I help them get the right resources? Where are the resources? If I don't know them, who can I contact? So just kind of keeping those things in mind when we're talking about our children and youth. I know the Adverse Childhood Experience Study, ACEs, when I first discovered it, I thought it was just amazing in the sense of, okay, yeah, I have all of these. Because if you take the ACEs test, there's about 10 questions on there asking, in your lifetime, have you experienced trauma? Are your parents divorced? Did you have a family member that was incarcerated? Did you have a family member that has a mental health issue? And I'm just like, yeah, okay. What, like, if we gave this test to our Native students back home on the res, everybody would be like, yep, 10 for 10. Yeah. Like, and it's not a good thing. So like, we don't want to traumatize our kids by telling them that they're going to have all this trauma and they're going to have mental health issues and heart disease and depression and suicide because they grew up in this environment. That's not what I'm saying. What I found or took away from the ACEs is that all these things can be going on, but at the end of the day, it's about us creating resiliency and creating a path to healing for our students, for our kids, that they can make it out of this, that it's not about making out of the reservation, because it's not the reservation necessarily that's bad, it's the environment or people that their support system might be broken. So how can we get them better support? How can we teach them that healing is an ongoing journey? It's not a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow that they're going to reach one day. It's an everyday choice, and they need to make that no matter where they come from. So next slide, I guess. Children exposed to violence and trauma exhibit significant higher levels of emotional and behavioral problems than their non-exposed peers. Witnessing or experiencing violence has been linked to lower grade point averages, more negative remarks in their cumulative records, and more reported absences from school than any other students. And again, we're looking at this from the student, like, oh, the student is absent a lot. Like, okay, it's not the student's fault though. And I can speak from a child who grew up in an abusive domestic violent home myself, who flunked first grade and who dropped out in ninth grade, that education was not my strong suit when I was a child because no one cared. My dad was not there putting me in bed. He was gone as young as 5. I was taking care of myself. I was grateful that my parents didn't have any more kids together. So it was just me taking care of me. I can only imagine if I had had younger siblings at the time to take care of. But I know just taking care of myself was hard. And yeah, I know my grades sucked. And I got then beat for those grades. So it's a full circle of violence going around. It felt like the school hated me because I was failing at school, and it felt like I was failing at home because my dad hated me because of the school. So we really got to make sure that we're not creating that same circle for our Native students. I don't want that happening to them. I want to somehow bridge that gap for our students to recognize that maybe it's not on the kid. Maybe there's a way that we can support this kid without involving the parents, without making the sacrifice of blaming the student, but rather encouraging the student and being there for the student. Long-term effects of structural violence associated with racism and discrimination can cause cardiovascular disease, diabetes, depression, and chronic fatigue. Again, just those structural violence, we can't have that racism and discrimination in our schools anymore. We need to support our Native students, and we need to support all people and races of color and religion, sexual orientation. According to a national survey done in 2013, conducted, about 7% of students had missed at least one day of school in the previous month because they felt unsafe at school or on their way to or from school. Again, because I grew up in the situation that I did, I grew up in foster care. No one really cared. I skipped school because I was being bullied at school because I was a new girl. There's all these underlying issues that can be going on with a student. Of course, you're going to skip school if you're being bullied every day at school. Why wouldn't you skip school? So how are we creating that safe space for our students to make sure that they feel welcomed, so that we're making sure that our other students are encouraging them to have pride in who they are, and that materialistic things are the most important thing, but that the individual is the most important thing, that our children are still the most sacred and precious thing, and that they deserve to be recognized as such. Next slide. Children who experience violence are impacted differently depending on age and other factors. Pay attention and seek guidance if sudden changes occur that may cause concern, such as, and this is where we're talking about symptoms and not behaviors. So like if someone's not usually moody and all of a sudden you notice like every day they're in a really bad mood every morning, they're letting you know that they haven't been sleeping. It kind of depends on what your situation is. Of course, as advocates, we might not know if they're not having nightmares. But as a parent, of course, if your kid's waking up with nightmares and this is a new development, or they're bedwetting and this has never occurred, but now it's an everyday thing, becoming aggressive or withdrawn from you, kind of starts talking back. Now, of course, some might be regular adolescent developments. I'm not saying that all of these are going to be like point on, but it's more about like, you should know your kid. And if you don't, the parents or guardian hopefully should know the kid. And if they've noticed some of these things, developmental delays, they're behind in school, drug and alcohol use at a young age, the students telling you that at 10 they started smoking weed, like why, what were you depressed about at 10, like what's going on, what are your thoughts, what do you think happened around that time, and then it might be something simple, and not that this is simple, but parents getting divorced, maybe that was the trigger, but maybe it's something deeper. Maybe they were sexually assaulted by a neighbor. Unfortunately, I had an elderly woman that came to me around Christmas time when I was an advocate, and she shared the story of her son. And this elderly woman was elderly. She was at least in her 70s. And so her son, I'm guessing, was in his 50s, and he had children. And she was trying to get gifts for her grandchildren. And her son was a very bad addict. And she just like started bawling out of nowhere, trying to get her grandchildren gifts. And how did any of this relate to domestic violence or sexual assault? When she tells me that her son hid being sexually assaulted his whole childhood by the neighbor next door, because the neighbor next door had said that he would kill his parents if he ever said anything. And so for years, this little boy, who's now a man, had been sexually assaulted almost his entire childhood out of fear that this man would kill his parents. And he never told anyone. And now as an adult man, he's struggling with drugs and alcohol every day since he was a young teenager. And his mother still is looking for resources for him. And I just want to share that because this is what we're talking about. This is the change we need. We need to start looking at these as symptoms and not as behaviors like, geez, he was such a great kid and then he just started acting up. Like, why does someone start acting up? We got to start asking those questions: the who, the how, the why, the what. Next slide, unless Vicki has anything to add to this one.
I just want to add that also some of the behavioral change might be a survival mechanism. So one of the things that I've seen with with some girls have been that they actually get into being more responsible, almost hyper responsible, where they're trying to make sure things are picked up and clean the house or take care of the other, their siblings and things like that. And then we see sometimes where, so that was some survival mechanism that kind of manifests itself in kind of a positive way, where people would think, oh, this is really cool that, she's helping out and, stuff like that. But it really, this child is changing their role in the family from a child to an adult in the house. Like they're starting to assume parental roles. And then the other thing I've seen with some of the boys is that they get to the point where they start to intervene to create safety for their non-offending parent that's being abused. And then the other thing that can happen is that child can start, not the same child, but a child can start assuming some of the same behaviors as the offending parent. So some of the aggressive mannerisms, some of the aggressive actions, such as throwing things, kicking something, punching the wall, calling names, stuff like that. And, a lot of times people will make an assumption, well, that's kind of somebody who's like maybe a teenager, but you can see it in like even a 6-year-old assuming some of those behaviors. And some of it is, learning through observation. And then the example in terms of some of the girls that I have seen is I see that as a survival mechanism. And actually through some of the work, we've learned that they started doing that, thinking they can help out and make a difference so their mother doesn't get hurt by cleaning the house, by taking care of kids, taking some of the burden of responsibility off her to hopefully avoid the abuse from happening.
I guess just to add, one of the other unfortunate effects of being sexually assaulted is also seeking out promiscuity and wanting to take power and control over your own body, the who, the what, the when. And a lot of young women and boys go down that road because of being sexually assaulted at a really young age. And it's hard. It's a hard road. And we need to be there to step up for these kids, to make sure that they have options, that they know that it wasn't their fault, that we're here to help them and support them and listen. And sometimes that's all a person needs. And sometimes it is greater than that, and the need is more. And so being prepared with resources and guidance for them is one of the things that we can do. So next slide. Advocates, teachers, parents, and caregivers can all make a difference. Next slide. And it's not that we just all make a difference. It's about being that one resilient, that one. When we talk about resiliency, I want to just put it really quickly in the framework of, for a long time, I would tell my story and people would be like, how did you live through that? And at the time when I was a lot younger, I didn't know. I was like, I just got lucky, I guess. I mean, I'm here. So I just keep going every day. But the reality of it now, looking back as a woman who's almost 40, I can say that it was my grandmothers. It was them being there and them being that resiliency, that force behind my parents' abuse, their love and their connection and their thoughtfulness to give me a Christmas gift, their influence over who I became spiritually and the religion and path that I chose in my life, and their stories of abuse, unfortunately, and domestic violence and what they went through. They were my resiliency. They gave me that power. They gave me that strength when I didn't have any, to recognize that it was a small thing, really. My grandmother told me when I was very young and I was experiencing abuse from my father, she told me that I could love my father without having to love the things that he did. I didn't have to love any of the things that he did. I could just love him for the person that he was. And that person that he was at one time her baby, that he was once her child, and she loved him from that place because that was her son. And I appreciated that, because I think as I grew up, it made me realize that that's exactly right. I don't have to love the abusive behavior. I don't have to have a relationship with this abusive person, but I can still have respect for him, and I can pray for him and have love for him right here in the safety and security of my own house, without having to put him in my bubble, in my space. So as we continue to work with kids individually, supporting them, getting that connection, that one resiliency, that one person, and that person can always be changing. My grandmothers have both passed away many years ago. And so since then, Vicky is a person in my life who brings me resiliency. My coworkers bring me resiliency. My children bring me resiliency. I look around at the people and the support group that I have, the network that is around me, and realize that in their own way, each person that I choose to surround myself with brings resiliency to me, because with their strength, I am stronger. And so that is the network that we're creating in our communities, is that our our peers, our children, our elders know that they can come to us and they can ask for help, and we're not going to close that door. We are going to help them be more resilient. We are going to guide them in every way that we can. And it's not that I'm doing it, it's that Creator is doing it, that the work is doing it, that each one of you that came here today is a part of our network and community. And if I don't know something, I can turn to one of you without fear and ask you for your help. And I know that you'll be there and you'll help our victims and our survivors as they get through their struggle. So individually, we can support our children and youth by, next slide, Novi, self-care, taking the time to help yourself and meet the needs of the children in your life. So first, being self-aware, making sure that you're taking time for yourself, because if you're waking up with little or no time, exhausted, frustrated, you're not going into the situation the best that you can, whether you're an advocate, a teacher, an administrator. It always trickles from the top down. So even if you're an administrator and you don't work with victims every day, but you're working with advocates every day, you still got to go in and put that work in to know that I'm taking care of me. I'm in a good space. I got my exercise in today, or I'm going to get it after work, or I got my 5 minutes of meditation in before I came to work, or I cried in the shower before I came to work. Whatever you need to do for your self-care to stay you do that first. Always try to make space for yourself and stay connected to who you are and your purpose for doing the work. Don't go to work angry and mad at victims and survivors who need your support and help. You may see the same victim 20 times. It may really be 20 times, and she may still have never left that abuser, but that's not my business. It's not about why she hasn't left. It's about, how can I support you today? What do you need today? How can I help you? You need a food basket? Let's make some calls. You guys don't have car insurance. Are there any programs that can help? What can I do to help you with the need that you have today? Because I know that that need is going to lessen her victimization when she goes home. If she can go home and have a food basket and that stops the abuse for one day, then I stopped the abuse for one day. I helped in any way that I could in that moment, and I didn't judge her. I didn't turn her away because this is her 20th time walking in the door. So just kind of that self-care is so super important, because it always starts with you first. Staying connected to your traditions, and whether you're a tribal member or you're a non-tribal member, it's not just about staying connected to your tribal traditions, it's about staying connected to the traditions of your family, of your culture, of your people, and making sure you're spending time doing things that you enjoy, making meals that are meaningful, whether you always have that Sunday crock pot going so your friends and family know that there's always going to be that good meal on Sundays, or there's always going to be that good meal on Wednesday nights, or we're going to go gather medicine in the spring, or sorry, probably not spring, in the fall. We're going to gather that medicine in the fall together. That's our yearly harvest. We're going to share stories when we're at the campfire. We're going to share seasonal stories as they're meaningful to our traditions and our cultures. when they're supposed to be shared, because for some of us, that's the way it is. We're going to dance together. We're going to go to powwows together. We're going to play those traditional games. We're going to involve our students in hand games and get them interested in traditional sports, lacrosse, different things, horseback riding. Tell children violence is not their fault. Number one, explaining to them that it is not their fault. No matter what's going on at home or what's going on in their life, they are precious, they are special, they are a gift, they are the most important thing. Healthy role models and healthy relationships make sure that we're setting that bar high for ourselves and for our relationships without being too hard on ourselves, because we are going to fail. We are going to fight and argue with our spouses. It's inevitable. But how are we handling that fight? Are we fighting fair? Are we being kind and considerate even when we're arguing? We don't got to take it to that next level of being violent and using words that are inappropriate in front of our kids, trying to role model that it's okay for people to have differences of opinions and not always believe in the same things, but we can still be friends and we can still argue and get along and still do it in an appropriate way. Promote and practice nonviolence. Again, that kind of goes with what we were just talking about. Creating safe and predictable environments for children to create routines and help children know what is accepted. If you haven't taken our Creating a Safe Space to Grow handout, we have that on our website, and it's a curriculum for advocacy. If you guys have the opportunity, you can surely download it, and there's some really good other resources on our website, but I just want to mention that here because it's a great resource for advocates trying to create a safe space to grow for our children. And that is the title of it. It was written by one of our staff here, and including Vicky. So just take an opportunity if some of you are looking for some more children advocacy resources. Vicky, do you have anything else to add to this slide?
Yeah, I just want to add to the very last part about that safe and predictable environment. I mean, that's huge about creating that routine, that predictability for children. Children without some level of structure, it's chaotic, and it actually creates like nurturing. So when we think about our smallest children, our babies and toddlers, that we hold them and we might wrap them in our blankets and hold them tight, that is safe. We're holding them. And so when we think about a safe and predictable environment, we're actually creating an environment that holds our children. And so I think it's important for us to recognize the importance of that. And so as an advocate, then you can help that victim mother to be able to think about how can they do that realistically within how they're living at the time. How can they create an environment that has predictability in there and creates routine? And it doesn't have to be an overcomplicated structure. It can be really, really a simplified way of doing things, but you want to have that structure, that routine, that predictability, so early afternoon, if it's small children, we take naps or we have quiet time. After school, we take a break and then we do homework. I mean, those basic routines go a huge distance in creating a nurturing, safe environment. Next slide. So just continuing to talk about building support and resiliency for children. When we think about that, and this particular question, for me, I'm asking it of you as an advocate. What can you do to build the support and resiliency for children within your program? And years ago, I worked on a project where we had a panel of adult children of domestic and sexual violence, and they were probably in the range of like 20 to 25 years old on this panel. And one of them talked about how all this violence was happening in his home. And he would go to these different programs and, his mom would ask for help. And in the midst of these multiple times that maybe law enforcement came to his house, they went to the advocate program, they went to a relative's house, nobody said one thing to him about what was going on. And he said, it's like they didn't see it. And he felt like nobody noticed and that he felt invisible in the process. And so for me, and I said this earlier about seeing a child, like really seeing a child in a way that that child is connected to you. And it's not a big process as an advocate. It can be something really simple, such as, hi, Timmy, I love your little red hat you've got on, or not little, but I love your red hat you've got on today. You're telling that child, I see you. Or even acknowledging, this must be hard for you. Just real simple pieces. And I know coming from a place where an advocate may not see themselves as a child advocate, that they might feel a little bit of a struggle of, what do I do? How do I do it in a way that's going to be helpful? But you need to see that child and let that child know that you see them. And it's small acts. Get that child a cup of water or a cup of juice. Ask that child if they'd like to sit down, or just acknowledge the child in some way along through the interaction. And then with that, there's ways that you can support their parent of how that parent can support that child. And I was thinking about one situation for myself. So I myself have a history where my former husband was an abusive person. And as a result of living in that relationship, after I was divorced, my son, who was very little at the time, had very aggressive behaviors and out of control aggressive behaviors as a very small child. And at one point, I was doing some therapy, and the therapist suggested we make an angry pillow, so that when he got aggressive, that he learned how to do it with the pillow and not like attacking people or tearing things apart in the house. And I think he was about 4 years old, maybe 5, when he got the angry pillow. And we went to the fabric store together. He picked out this really gaudy fabric, which was just, it was something I would have never even imagined wanting to have in my house, but he picked it out, and I cut it out, and we talked about how big it should be and how stuffed it should be and different things like that. And so cut it to the size that he wanted. And then I sewed it, and then he stuffed it. And then I finished sewing it up and put some buttons on it. And we talked about what that pillow was for. And that child had that pillow with him till he was 18 years old and graduated from high school. And he talked about when he got rid of that pillow, that it was actually time for him to let it go, but it was sad to let it go because it helped him a lot. And it was just a real small suggestion that therapist gave me. And then it was left up to me what I did with that. And I really wanted to help my son. So I took some steps and did it with my son. And it became really a meaningful piece that he had for a number of years. And through that, he started to learn that anger isn't something that you throw all over the place, that it has its place. And he started to learn about how to manage some of his emotions. And then when we think about other ways that we can support children, I think about within our programs, whether it's a shelter or even attached to our crisis program or a transitional program that we might have within our tribe, or even some other community cultural program, there are ways we can have different activities and get those kids involved in being children. Take the kids to a drum, so that they can learn and become part of a drum group. An organization that I work with, they have 2 drum groups on a weekly basis. They have one for teenagers and they have one for younger kids. And then as kids grow through that, they integrate it into their older drum group. And it helps them build a peer relationship. So not only is it culturally centered, and they understand and they learn the teachings of how they're supposed to act and be with the drum and the importance of the drum within their own tribe. But it also is a place where they learn how to be good relatives to each other, to the others that are sitting at the drum. And then that same organization, that same program, they have a garden that they grow, and they teach the children in the garden. So the children get to plant some of the plants, they get to do some of the harvesting, they get to make salads and prepare foods out of it through different activities that they do. And that's huge because it gives them a different focus. So when you're living with violence, your life becomes all about the trauma that's going on in the house, all about the hardship that's going on in your house. And having some of these different things can help kids learn how to be kids again and to build that social connection that they may have lost through the abuse, or may have lost the ability on how to act in ways that people want to be with them. So those are some critical ways to engage. And I think there's a lot of ways that a program can brainstorm. Another program that I worked with doesn't matter where they were at, I can't think of it anyway. Another program, they actually did a lot of language work with their children that were in their program, and teaching them, names of basic items, such as, how do you say apple? How do you say tree? How do you say door? Just different basic terms, and then also small phrases. And they would do it in playful ways, teaching children how to learn their own language at an early age, which actually helped them in a longer way as they grew up into youth, that they had, their mouth could move in ways that had developed to be able to form their Indigenous words. So there's lots of ways you can think of what you can do to support and build resiliency. And central to that is do things so that the children know that they're seen by you. Amber, do you want to add to that?
No, I think those were really great suggestions. And I myself, I have 4 sons, and so I can relate to boys and testosterone and anger, and where it's appropriate and where it's not, because we don't want to teach boys that anger is bad, because it's part of who they are. So by telling them that it's bad, then they're bad, and that's not the situation. It's more so there's a place for anger. And so for us in our family, sports has been the place. I'm like, you want to push someone around? Join football. You want to throw somebody down? Okay, well then go branding with your dad and throw those cows down. Like, so there's different ways that they've had to learn to use their anger. But I think that every family has their own way of dealing with things. And when we talked about self-care earlier, mentoring those self-care things with your kids. If beading is something you like to do, teaching your kids how to bead. If you go for a walk every morning, including your kids in those walks, whether it's 15 minutes or 30 minutes. If you like to listen to music when you're scared or nervous, it's teaching them to listen to music when they're scared and nervous, whether that's traditional music or contemporary music of today. What works for them, what works for you. And there are going to be things that they're going to take away. But I think mainly the thing is that you aren't teaching them that what they're doing is wrong. It's teaching them a way to deal with it, and not that they're bad, but that we all get angry. We all get upset. This is how I deal with it when I'm upset. And this is how you can deal with it. And I love Of course, as an advocate, one of the things we always do is when someone comes into our office, welcoming them, asking them if they need a drink of water. But it's the same thing for our kids. It's not overlooking them. It's taking the time to be like, hi, honey, do you want something to drink? Do you want something to eat? Can I get you a snack? Having those things on hand. We don't know if that child was up terrorized all night, hasn't slept. We don't know where they're at right now. So just being kind and considerate, and they're in a new environment, and their last environment might have been pretty scary. So you're a stranger. I wouldn't expect a super big warm welcome, but just being kind and considerate is going to go a long way. And maybe the next time they see you, they might open up a little bit more. So just kind of keeping that in mind. Next slide. And then I think together, we just have some collaborative ideas and support ideas coming up here in the next couple of slides before we wrap up. Next slide. Promoting a shared vision and common language to prevent and heal child trauma, recognizing it as a root cause of poor life circumstances. So really just all of us, again, coming together and understanding that it's about the language that we use. It's about preventative language. It's about healing childhood trauma and recognizing that it's not the child's fault, that we all come from, and not every individual, but we as Native people, a lot of us come from poor circumstances, and that we need to bridge those community gaps between services available and services provided, and make sure that we're providing those to all of our Indigenous people that come through and need services. Next slide. Ensuring meaningful participation and leadership of survivors, first responders, community providers, faith-based leaders, teachers, and parents, and ensuring their voices are incorporated throughout the process. So in another later webinar, I hope all of you can come back and join us again, because we're going to have some upcoming webinars, but we are going to get into talking about creating a CCR, which is the community-centered response to trauma. And so in creating a community-centered response, some of the people you would look at having on that team are going to be survivors, first responders, community leaders, tribal community leaders, and faith-based leaders. And it doesn't mean that they all have to be at every meeting, but it's about giving them the opportunity to help you build the resources you need to provide a holistic care to your community and to your students. And incorporating that and their voices into the policies and procedures that you're going to have for your organization and possibly for the school. So keep those things in mind when you're talking about what you want to do in the future. Or now that you've seen this webinar, like, I want to go out there and make some policy changes. Where do I begin? These are some of the people you might look at providing care to your survivors and victims, and that might be good partnerships for you. Next slide. Advocate for widespread training that provides parent and staff with educational resources on trauma and healing. So having those parent teacher nights, or having those parent appreciation mornings, muffins with mom, bingo with dad, dances with dad, whatever you guys have going on. Incorporate a little bit of trauma-informed care and healing activities into your daily organizations. Like, get those kids connected with their parents, having those things, muffins with mom, those are important activities. And also not leaving it open to just mom. Open it up, because mom might have to work. So can grandma come? Can auntie come? Bring your favorite sister. Just having different activities so everybody feels included instead of excluded. Next slide. Providing evidence-based, culturally relevant, and community-supported programming in tribal communities. And that sounds like a mouthful, but really what we're doing is bringing back some of our traditions and values into our educational system. And in North Dakota here, they recently just passed a bill to support tribal education in schools and help bring some more historical content to our educational systems. And I think that as they continue to do that, we'll see more people coming in to get services, because it's a realization of, I'm not alone. My story isn't alone. I am healing, I am on a journey, and I need help and support. And I want to incorporate my culture into the support systems that I have and that I need. It's part of who I am. So just keeping those things in mind. Next slide. Support social strategies that promote and the evidence that we can end child trauma. Advocate for better and more consistent data. And I know the next slide is going to talk about data, so we'll just go on to that one. Advocate for better and more consistent data. Use data to identify communities with the greatest needs so they can become a priority for training, intervention, and other resources. Forge new partnerships to create creative, collaborative, community-centered responses for victims and survivors. So again, it's about us as technical and training providers, but as victims and advocacy programs and as school-based programs, that we really start collecting the data, that we make sure that we're creating space for those secondary victims. If you're an advocacy center, like Vicki said at the beginning, a lot of times as victim service providers, we're like, well, we don't do kids here though. You know, we only provide services to victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. Kids aren't really our thing, but the reality is you've got victims coming in with kids, and so they're a secondary victim. So adding that sheet into your data, or that little check mark box, is there a secondary victim? It's a yes, and that's going to help you with more funding, more resources, because really you are serving them, you're just not reporting them. And so there's kind of some things that can be done to help you catch those numbers. And it's not just about catching them for numbers purposes and funding, but it's about the individual, because if we don't have funding and resources, then we don't really have anything to provide that victim when they're walking in our door. So we just want to make sure that we're providing the best possible care. And so part of that is collecting that data. And I just want to really push that forward, because I think a lot of times as Natives, we're a little bit on the sketchy side of anyone wanting to know what they're going to use our data for. Like, what's this going to be for? You're not going to get some crazy grant and then like, I've got to fulfill your needs. Like, make sure you know what the data is going to be used for, who you're giving the data to and for, and make sure you're checking all the boxes with your tribe and anyone that might be a part of the process for you to receive any type of funding if you're collecting data from your program. So just things to keep in mind. Vicki, do you have anything? I think this might be the last slide for, I know we want to go one more. Yep, I think that's it. So just in closing, we'll just kind of let you guys know what our TA training and technical assistance, what we provide here at Redwind. So we are an experienced problem-solving strategies to meet the challenges of addressing sexual assault, domestic violence, dating violence, and stalking. We offer in-person and online educational opportunities, peer-to-peer consulting, on-site technical assistance, and tailored assistance for OVW grantee and portal grantees. So that just means if you are in one of those categories, feel free to reach out to us. And anyone that joined today's webinar, we will have some upcoming webinars for children and youth, and also some homeless and housing TA also. So if any of you can join us for any of our upcoming webinars, they're all posted on our calendar activities on, sorry, Tyler. They are all on our calendar of events at redwind.net. So if any of you guys want to log on to our website, you can easily find the trainings there. Vicki, do you have anything else to add?
No, that was good.
Awesome. Well, again, we thank you guys for joining us. If anyone has any questions, we'll just leave it up here for a few minutes. If there's anything anyone wants to ask in the chat. If not, we appreciate you all coming here today and look forward to hearing from you in the future. And we're excited to work with you guys. Like I said, we have some upcoming children and youth webinars. I think up next is the Sacredness of Fatherhood on September 8th. So anyone wishing to join in, that'll be September 8th at 1 o'clock. And then I do believe the next one after that will be trauma-informed care in teens. And that will be happening September 25th, I believe. Again, those are all on our schedule of upcoming activities and events. So feel free to register early for those or contact us if you have more questions. We'll also be having a Children and Youth Conference this spring. So we'll have a lot of good speakers and information coming up then, and we can get those dates out to you later. It hasn't been official yet, but it'll be upcoming. So just letting you guys know, hopefully we'll be back out there in the world providing technical and training assistance in the near future. Hang in there with us as we continue virtual training through COVID.
Alrighty, thank you. Before we end the session, I want to let you all know that there will be an eval popping up once Zoom closes. We'd love to hear what you thought. So if you're able to fill that out, we'd very much appreciate it. In closing, I'd like to thank our presenters. I'd like to thank our captioner, and I'd like to thank all of you for joining us. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day. I hope you all stay safe, and I hope to see you all at the next webinar.
Thank you.